I'm going to tell you about a tenant that will pay you every month whilst destroying the value of your property. So I might be being a little bit dramatic there, but I get asked about sitting tenants all the time. Maybe you've actually asked this question on the channel, and people get really confused about what a sitting tenant is. And the truth is, it could be something that's really great for the value of your property, or it can completely shatter it. Well, Jamie, how can it be both? Well, I'm going to break that down for you right now. So people get confused about what a sitting tenant actually is. And a sitting tenant actually represents any tenant that is paying you as the landlord, that whilst you are trying to sell that asset or your property, they are still sat in the property. And there's three main types that you want to be aware of. Type number one is those on a fixed contract. So you would have heard of something called an AST. And a fixed term is typically 6 to 12 months. Now, those tenants, they're paying on a monthly basis. They've probably got a deposit with you, and they are fixed within that. The reason that's important to understand is you cannot kick somebody out unless they're not paying and things like that within that fixed term contract. Type number two, again, they are on a AST, but it's called a periodic. A periodic AST. Now, it's exactly the same type of tenant as the above, but they are outside of their fixed term. Still something to be aware of, because what they're on is a rolling contract or a periodic contract. What that means is they can't go, oh no, I'm going to stay here for another year, but you'll still have to give them notice. And that's really important, because if you want to kick them out, subject to them being a normal paying tenant, right now you need to give that tenant 4 months notice. And if you're looking to sell your property, that can have a dramatic impact. The third type is somebody called a regulated tenant. Okay, now put a D on there. A regulated tenant. Now, the reason a regulated tenant is so much scarier is because of the Landlord Act 1988. It came into play in January of 1989, and essentially at that point, before that, tenants had a lot more rights. Now, let me tell you some of these rights. First of all, it could mean, because there's different ones before this, it could mean that they have life rights to rent out the property. What? So if you needed your property back, you needed to kick them out for whatever reason, you just can't do it as long as they are paying on a monthly basis. But it gets a lot worse. What it actually can be with some regulated tenants is they have inherited rights. And what this means is they can carry on passing it down to family members, which means technically you couldn't take that property back, or your kids and their kids couldn't take the property back to do anything with until either the bloodline died out or they decided that they didn't want to carry on with their tenancy. Pretty bad, right? But it gets worse. Some regulated tenancies, it means that not only can they hand it down the bloodlines, but you can never increase the rental payments. So say, for example, their rental agreement was set up in 1970 for £56 a month or whatever it is, and it is fixed like that for the full duration of their life and their kids' life, which means you have to rent out the property to them for life at that reduced rate, and you can never actually increase that. But does this impact the value of the property? The answer, in short, is yes, and it kind of depends. Well, let me go to the outcome, the worst type, the regulated tenants. And when I say worse, by the way, when I'm saying that, I mean financially worse for you. Now, if you've got a regulated tenant that is lifelong, so that means that their kids will inherit the property, and it's a fixed rate from 1950s and they're paying £50 a month, that obviously massively impacts the property value. So much so that sometimes it can actually impact it by up to 60% of the property value. Which means that a £200,000 property could be worth as little as £80,000. Did I do that right? Yeah. £80,000, okay? If it's a bit more normalized, for example, it's just got somebody that's a fixed tenant, you can't ever kick them out as long as they're paying the rents, that is much better, but it still has a massive impact. Typical values of those properties, you will reach about 75 to 85% of the true market value. Well, you might go, well, why? Well, because the value of a property is dictated by a few things. A real key part of it is the lendability. And what I mean by that is, can it be mortgaged? Now, you have to understand that when a mortgage company, a bank or whatever it is funding the debt portion of a property purchase, they're looking at their risk. So not only how much money will we make, but if we needed to repossess this property, could we do it? And could we sell on the property? Well, those regulated tenant rights, they move around to the other owner. So it's not like I sell the property and then suddenly they didn't make the agreement with that tenant. The agreement is with the property, not the person when it's regulated, right? So what that means for a mortgage provider is if they needed to repossess the property and then sell on the property, they wouldn't be able to kick out the tenant either, and they would have to sell it with that tenant in. Now, you could say, well, there's loads of investors, around 2.5 million buy-to-let landlords in the UK, so there's still going to be a lot of demand. Well, yes and no. When you think of the millions more that could potentially buy it and therefore inflate the value of the property, it's basic economic supply and demand. So expect 75% to 85% of the true market value. But what about a normal tenant? What about somebody that's on a fixed AST or a limited or periodic AST? Does it affect the value? Ultimately, yes. But let me break that down a little bit more. I think it really depends on the property value. So what I've experienced is if it's less than or equal to around 200,000, dependent on the location. So for example, closer to 200,000 down south, closer to like 100,000 up north, I found that it doesn't actually impact the property value that much. The reason is that this is investment territory anyway. So if an investor were looking to buy this on a yield or a return on capital, it would probably tick their boxes close to the market value, but you might end up shaving off 5-10 grand to facilitate that. However, once you get much above the 200,000 mark, this is where it has a fairly dramatic impact, because if it goes above, a lot of those won't actually be in rental territory for a majority of buy-to-let landlords. So you're focusing on the richer end, the more wealthy end, people that have got the millions lying around that are happy to buy a £500,000 flat in London and just let it sit there to go up in capital value, right? So once that's limited, those types of investors that can move quicker in that niche territory will be expecting a discount, so it will impact it. Again, I'd be expecting any sort of impact between 5 and 10% of the property market value, which might not seem that significant, but on £500,000, that's up to £50,000 having an impact on that. So the question is, should you give the tenant notice and get them kicked out of the property before you try and sell it, or should you try and sell them with the tenant in? And that's really going to depend, because whilst you might get a little bit more with the tenant being out of the property, you also have to understand that there is a set risk when you're selling the property. So first of all, it's going to take a couple of months to go through legals, but you've also got the wait time and the fact that on the open market there's a 1 in 3 chance of the property falling out of bed. All of this needs to get taken account of in the risk, because if the tenant's not there, guess who's paying the mortgage? You, not the tenant. You won't be getting in the rent. And guess who's paying the council tax? You guessed it, you. And who's paying the water and the gas and the electric? Shock horror, you again. And so each month that it goes on, dependent on your location, that could be costing you £500 up to a couple of £1,000 on a monthly basis that somebody would be covering if you did have it in the first place. So one final tip with this, that if you are choosing to have the tenant stay in the property, communication is key. Okay, you need to communicate that you're selling the property, that you're going to make sure that if they want to stay there, that the buyer is going to look after them in some way, or that they want to leave. Could they have first refusal on the property, so the tenant actually wants to buy it? which is always a good cause because people want to make their house their home. But ultimately, communication is going to be a key thing to think about within this. So overall, do you need to worry about sitting tenants? Honestly, I think unless you're sitting right up there, and even at 200,000, I don't think it's too much impact. I think at about $500,000, it really does become the point where it's worth getting the tenant out or offering for them to purchase it first. Everything else within this remit of an AST, either fixed or periodic, I personally wouldn't worry too much about it. I don't think you're going to get impacted in too much. Now, this is the key. If you've got regulated tenants or you're thinking about purchasing a property with regulated tenants, that is when I would be expecting a significant discount. For me personally, I would be wanting at least 25% off of the market value if it's just until that person passes away. So if it's worth $500,000, personally, I wouldn't touch it for less than 400 for more than 400,000. And I'd look at the contract of their rights to see how far it's going. Is it going to their kids? Is it a fixed rate rent? And I'd want more and more off the property to facilitate that risk. The reality of this is, are you ever going to come across something that is regulated? Probably not. There are around 100,000 of these properties in the UK right now that are tenanted by this regulated tenant type, which is about 0.4% of what's available in the UK housing stock. So 100,000 properties out of around 25 million. So a 0.4% chance that you're going to come across this. And even if you do, the people selling these properties are limited to buyers like you, so you're more than likely going to get a great discount anyway. And as we know over time, in a majority of locations, the true wealth from property actually comes from the capital growth in any case. So if you've got one of these contracts where somebody's 70 odd living in these properties, it will probably end up making a good investment anyway. But you let me know. Hopefully this has added value, but let me know in the comments, have you ever come across a regulated sitting tenant? Have you ever purchased one? What complications have you come across? Make sure to let me know what you thought in the video. And if you're not already a subscriber, you know what to do. Hit the subscribe and the notification bell, and I'll see you this Friday in the up and coming video.